No!
It's nothing. It's easy. It is in and out.
Are you... No! Absolutely not! What does any of this mean?
Well, exactly what it says. It's a list of instructions. So post the letter of resignation and then get Henry and just leave. I mean, as you can see, he doesn't feel the need to tell me why or where we're supposed to go, just that I am to do it. And that if anyone from his department tries to contact me, then...
Don't talk to them, don't meet with them, don't believe them.
That's it. Now, does anything about that letter strike you as odd?
Yes! Everything! It's the single most terrifying thing I've ever read in my life!
No, John, that's not what I mean! Look, John, you know me. In fact, the only person that knows me better is him. Would either of you expect me to read that and then just go, oh, I know, I'll do what I'm told, and I won't think any further on it, I'll just pop off? Does that even remotely sound like me?
Not right now, it doesn't, no.
And he knows that. Which brings me to the big favour.
Lucy, I'm not sure.
Okay, so I went into his home office looking for clues as to what he might have been working on, and there's nothing. He's been hidden in there for 2 months, nothing to show for it. Now, either he took his files and tatty orange notebook with him, or it's in his other office, the one at the police station. Now, I can't access that. In fact, the only person that can is James. Or somebody who looks remarkably like him.
No!
It's nothing. It's easy. It is in and out.
Are you... No! Absolutely not!
I've been there. I know the layout. You won't have to talk to anybody.
Really? And if they talk to me?
We'll just stick to small talk. Just keep walking.
What small talk? Have you heard my small talk? This, right now, is about as good as it gets.
Look, I've met most of his colleagues. I mean, I can brief you on all of them. Certainly enough to get you through a piddly little visit to the office, just there and back.
Lucy, stop! That would be illegal. James wouldn't just abandon his family without reason. He knows what that feels like. If he's not telling you everything, it's because he's trying to keep you safe.
This is how he does it. You don't get it. That isn't a letter that a husband of 20 years sends his wife, no matter how much he's trying to protect her. There's nothing personal in it. There's no comfort. No feeling. It's more like the type of letter that...
That's true.
Maybe I shouldn't have involved you. I don't know, I should,
I love you. Always have.
Oh.
I-L-O-V-E. It's an acrostic. The same one we used as kids. It's the same one every kid learns.
Oh, right! Right, yes, what?
The first letter of each sentence. I'll just be in and out, right?